In the 1820s, convicts, working a rough track through the Blue Mountains, began telling a story that nobody in charge particularly wanted to hear. Strange lights, they said, flickered along a distant line of limestone cliffs after dark, accompanied by sounds nobody could place, drifting out of rock that, as far as any official record was concerned, had nothing inside it at all. Nobody investigated. The convicts were not exactly the kind of witnesses colonial authorities took seriously, and the reports quietly disappeared into the margins of the record for over a decade. It would take a manhunt for an escaped outlaw to finally prove those convicts had been telling the truth the entire time. If this is your first time here, welcome to Lost Australia. And make sure you are subscribed, because we dig into stories exactly like this every single week, the corners of this country's history that got buried under everything that came after them. The caves in question are known today as Jenolan, and what sits underneath that unassuming stretch of the Blue Mountains turned out to be something researchers would not fully understand for another 170 years. In 2006, a team of geologists from the University of Sydney and the CSIRO published research settling a question that had quietly puzzled scientists for decades. Clay found scattered throughout the cave system, material so ordinary that early workers at the site had simply been using it to patch leaking pipes, turned out to be roughly 340 million years old. That finding made Jenolan the oldest known open cave system anywhere on Earth, predating the Dead Sea Scroll caves by more than 240 million years, and pushing back what scientists had assumed about the site's age by a staggering margin. Until that research was published, most geologists had estimated the caves were only a few thousand years old. Before European settlers ever set foot near the entrance, this land belonged to the Gundungurra people, who knew the area as Bunuumia, a place carrying deep cultural significance long before anyone attached the word cave system to it in an official capacity. That connection did not end with colonisation. It continues today, layered underneath every geological superlative and every tourist brochure describing the site. The official European discovery story begins around 1838, when a local settler named James Whelan, out searching the ranges with his brother Charles, was tracking something considerably more urgent than scientific curiosity. An escaped convict and bushranger named James McKeown had been using the rugged limestone country as a hideout, and the Whelan brothers were determined to run him down. In the course of that pursuit, they stumbled onto the cave entrances that had apparently been sheltering McKeown from the law, entrances that, if those earlier convict reports of lights and strange sounds were accurate, had been quietly known about, at least by someone, for years before any settler officially laid claim to the discovery. That detail alone should give you pause. If McKeown really had been using the caves as a hideout, and if convicts a decade earlier really had reported unexplained lights and sounds coming from that exact stretch of cliffs, the caves were not undiscovered country at all when the Whelan brothers arrived. They were simply undiscovered by anyone whose word colonial authorities were prepared to trust. Before we go further, I want to mention something that connects directly to stories like this one. I put together an ebook called The Timeline Lie, covering 15 documented sites across every Australian state where peer-reviewed research has quietly rewritten the history most of us were taught in school evidence that is decades old, fully verified, and still barely known outside academic circles. If a story like Jenolan interests you, that book goes even deeper into the parts of this country's past that were never properly explained to the public. The link is below this video if you want to take a look. What happened after that official discovery moved remarkably fast for a colonial era government not typically known for urgency. By 1866, the site, then still known as the Fish River Caves, was formally gazetted as a government reserve, making it only the second area in the world set aside specifically for conservation purposes, trailing only Yellowstone by a matter of years. The following year, a man named Jeremiah Wilson was appointed as the first official keeper of the caves, tasked with managing and guiding visitors through a network that, at the time, had barely begun to be mapped. Early exploration of the deeper chambers was primitive and genuinely dangerous. Guides worked their way through unlit passages, using firelight and improvised torches, later switching to burning magnesium wire, an early and unstable form of artificial lighting that produced an intensely bright flame, but carried its own obvious risks in a confined, poorly ventilated underground space. Visitors during this era were led through passages that had barely been secured, along tracks that would be considered wildly unsafe by any modern standard, drawn by a site that had rapidly transformed from an outlaw's hideout into one of the colony's most talked about natural attractions. If you are finding this as fascinating as I am, make sure you are subscribed, because what happened at Jenolan over the following decades turned genuinely strange in ways that had nothing to do with outlaws or geology at all. By the late 19th century, Jenolan had become something closer to a health resort than a simple cave system. Visitors of means travelled by train and coach specifically to bathe in the cave's underground rivers, convinced the mineral-rich waters carried genuine therapeutic properties. The first Jenolan Caves house was constructed in 1880 to accommodate the growing flow of wealthy tourists, and its architectural descendant still stands on the site today, a genuine relic of an era when a remote limestone cave system in the Blue Mountains had somehow become a fashionable destination for the colony's elite. In the years that followed, the caves hosted an even stranger use, becoming an occasional venue for live concerts, with musicians performing inside the vast natural acoustics of the caverns themselves, turning 340 million year old limestone chambers into a genuine, functioning performance space. Over a century and a half of continuous exploration, researchers have identified more than 300 separate caves within the wider Jenolan system, connected by over 20 kilometres of mapped passages, phreatic loops, breakdown chambers, and underground rivers still actively shaping the rock today. Despite that scale, only around a dozen of those caves have ever been developed for public tours. The overwhelming majority of the system remains exactly as it was when the Wallen brothers first stumbled into it, unlit, unmapped by casual visitors, and largely unseen by anyone outside dedicated research and survey teams. That gap between what the public actually sees and what genuinely exists underground is worth sitting with. Every tour bus that pulls up to the Grand Arch, every visitor walking through the handful of lit, developed show caves is experiencing a tiny fraction of a system that stretches for kilometres beyond what any path currently reaches. Fossilised corals and brachiopods, remnants of an ancient seafloor from the Silurian period more than 400 million years ago, sit embedded in limestone throughout passages that most people will never walk through. Evidence of an ocean that existed on this stretch of the continent long before anything resembling a mountain range had risen above it. What remains today is a site carrying at least 3 separate layers of history that rarely get discussed together. A geological record stretching back 340 million years, only properly understood by science in the last 2 decades. A cultural connection belonging to the Gundungurra people that predates any European account by an unmeasured span of generations. And a colonial discovery story that only exists in its current form because a bushranger needed somewhere to hide, and because 2 brothers cared more about catching him than they did about the eerie stories convicts had already been quietly telling for years. The site's transformation from outlaw hideout to public attraction never really stopped evolving either. Over the following century, Jenolan drew visitors well beyond the wealthy tourists who once travelled out for its therapeutic waters, eventually receiving members of the British royal family, including Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Charles, a strange full circle for a site whose entire recorded history began with a manhunt for a man deliberately hiding from the same colonial authority that the royal visit ultimately represented. In 1994, the surrounding bushland faced its own reminder of how exposed this landscape remains to the forces still shaping it, when a major bushfire burned through more than 6,000 hectares around the reserve. A stark contrast to the slow, patient, 340 million year processes that built the caves themselves. There is a particular irony sitting underneath all of this that rarely makes it into the official brochures. For close to 2 decades before the Wallen brothers arrived, this land had been walked quietly by convicts working nearby roads, men whose accounts of strange lights and unexplained sounds were dismissed simply because of who they were rather than what they claimed to have seen. Colonial record keeping in this period was rarely kind to witnesses without status or standing, and it took a bushranger's need for a hideout, followed by 2 free settlers with the social standing to be believed before any of it became official. The caves did not become real to colonial authorities the moment something strange started happening inside them. They became real the moment the right people said so. That pattern is worth remembering every time a site like this gets reduced to a single tidy headline. 340 million years of geological history did not become true in 2006 when researchers finally proved it. It had simply been sitting there the entire time, waiting for the right tools and the right people to take a proper look. The convicts who reported lights along those cliffs in the 1820s were describing something real, even if nobody in a position of authority was willing to write it down as fact, until an escaped man and 2 brothers chasing him gave the story a version colonial Australia was finally prepared to believe. The caves are still there, still mostly unexplored, beyond their public sections, still holding on to a history that started long before anyone with the authority to write it down was willing to listen.